Hello everybody. Since I've already responded to Alex O'Connor and redeemed Zuma on this channel, I figured I might as well give my thoughts on the video where the former responds to the latter. For context, I've already made a two-part video where I gave my thoughts on redeemed Zuma's responses to every atheist argument. I would recommend you watch those two videos now, because knowing my own thoughts on the argument is important context before we get into my response to Alex. One specific reason for this is that I rated each argument redeemed Zuma makes, so to make this video a more manageable length, I'm only going to be looking at Alex's responses to arguments from Zuma that I gave at least a 7 out of 10, because any argument I rated lower than that, there's not really much point me defending. There's a nice round 18 arguments that I rated a 7 or higher from Zuma, so let's see for how many of them Alex would agree with my belief that this is a good argument, and if he doesn't, why doesn't he? So firstly, we start off with Zuma criticizing the idea that religions cause war by pointing out they cause relatively few. Alex makes a few objections to this point, firstly arguing it's a problem that religion causes war at all.
Isn't it a problem that it causes any wars? The claim is not that religion causes all wars, or even most wars, just that it sometimes causes wars.
This is technically true, but I think misses the spirit of the issue. Lots of things cause war, but the point is that the idea that religion is a constant fount of unnecessary conflict seems incorrect if it's only responsible for 7% of wars. He says it's a problem that religions cause war at all, but I'd say that the problem is wars happening, and that religion causing those wars is neither here nor there. If you removed religion as a cause and the untold death and destruction was caused by something else instead, that wouldn't solve any problems. He also makes a funny analogy to National Socialism.
To use a crude example, as far as I'm aware, National Socialism only ever caused one war. One out of the thousands that we have documented. But of course, even if the vast majority of wars were started for other reasons, it's still a problem that this caused a war at all. Not a perfect analogy, but...
Not a perfect analogy indeed. This is bizarre because wouldn't it be worse if National Socialism caused no wars? What if we just agreed to give Hitler everything he wanted? What if we just kept appeasing and avoided all wars? Would that be a better outcome? In giving this analogy, Alex demonstrates the precise opposite point, because the problem with National Socialism has nothing to do with how many wars it caused. Indeed, the problems with National Socialism is precisely why our willingness to start a war to destroy it was a good thing. So generally, it would seem like ideologies and worldviews can have problems, and that war is always a bad thing, but that the convergence of these two realities in the question of whether ideologies and worldviews, or religions more specifically, sometimes cause wars seems profoundly unimportant.
And it's worth asking, wherever there is a totally non-religious conflict, do you think that such a conflict would be calmed or exacerbated if we were to introduce religious conviction?
This seems like a question that's too vague to be worth engaging with. If there was a shared religion amongst both sides, then that could calm the war. If the religion was very pacifist, it might calm the war. This also assumes that if a war is totally non-religious, religious conviction can't already be present. I think George Bush Jr. had sincere religious conviction, but the invasion of Iraq was not a religious war. It was the secular United States overthrowing the secular Ba'athist regime for secular reasons relating to economics, neo-imperialism, and lies about WMDs. So if we take this totally non-religious war, and then add religious conviction to it, nothing changes, because religious conviction was already present. It just wasn't a motivating factor for the war. Anyway, next we get to tick one off quickly because Alex agrees with Zuma's point about how we know which religion is true. Now, the next argument is very interesting. Basically, Alex picks up on something that I must admit I didn't pick up on at all.
That's fine if you want to say that science has nothing to say about God, but you've just undercut a great deal of natural theology.
Now, Zuma actually released a video where he explained that he personally doesn't find arguments based on observations about the natural world convincing, so he's consistent here. However, I personally do find arguments based on observations about the natural world convincing, so I actually disagree with Zuma here. See, I only focused on the part where Zuma said that science can't disprove God, and I didn't focus on his claim that science can't prove God. In my view, the former is true, but not the latter. And this is for the simple reason that we could imagine that God is a God of order. Indeed, Christianity presents God as generally a God of order. So how could science disprove God? Well, we could observe the natural world functioning without any apparent supernatural influence, But that doesn't disprove God, since it could just prove there's a God who likes to order things to function naturally. Alternatively, we might observe the natural world functioning in a way that's wildly inconsistent, and in a way where things are constantly happening magically and miraculously, in which case that wouldn't disprove the supernatural. Indeed, it would be strong evidence for the supernatural. So science, which is observations about the natural world, can't disprove the supernatural, since the only thing it can observe is the supernatural not directly intervening in the natural. So if in the natural world anything pertaining to the supernatural is actually observed, it could only possibly be evidence of the supernatural. I'd be interested to hear whether anybody disagrees with this and thinks it would be possible for science to disprove the supernatural, or that clear scientific observations of breaks in the law of nature wouldn't count as evidence for the supernatural. Either way, Alex is right here to point out that Zuma is saying that the natural world can't prove the existence of God, and I for my part disagree with Zuma on that. Next we have Zuma's response to the claim that the Gospels were anonymous.
Okay, the consensus of New Testament scholars seems to be that we don't have sufficient evidence for the traditional authorship of the Gospels.
So I don't think this is directly responding to Zuma's point, which was mostly that anonymous isn't the same thing as not knowing who wrote them, which is a valid point. A text may not have a signed author, but we can still have reasons to accurately theorize about its authorship. O'Connor does specifically quibble whether Zuma's right about an exact piece of evidence he gives, which is something that I don't really know that much about. I still stand by my agreement with Zuma that the absence of the Gospels specifically declaring the author themselves doesn't disprove traditional authorship, but I'm not going to get into the veracity of the scholarship that does uphold that authorship. Next we got onto Alex's response to the claim that Jesus did claim to be God. His main point is that Jesus made a strong claim to be God in John's Gospel.
Jesus definitely seems to claim to be God in John's Gospel, but maybe not so much in the Synoptics.
I've pointed this out before, but I'll just reiterate that it seems likely to me that we only think Jesus' claim of being God is more clear in the Gospel of John because it is more gentilic. From our perspective as non-Jews, it seems more clear. However, from a Jewish perspective, Jesus claims to be God in the Synoptic Gospels as clear as day by claiming things about himself that only God can claim according to biblical Judaism. To this, Alex has an objection.
You've identified forgiving sins as something that only God can do. I wouldn't be so sure. Take a look at John chapter 20, verse 21 onwards. Jesus is speaking here to his disciples after the resurrection. Again, Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." And with that he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, their sins are forgiven."
This is a passage that I actually have notes on, as I plan to offer up an interpretation of it at some point, because it is on the surface level a very confusing passage. However, the main issue is that Alex is taking a new development in the faith that happened with the new covenant and acting as if that discounts the significance of what Jesus did under the old covenant. For example, Jesus worked on the Sabbath, which under Judaism is blasphemous because only God has the right to work on the Sabbath. However, I also work on the Sabbath, because my Sabbath rest is in Christ's finished work on the cross as per Romans 4. So I do what Jesus did, but in a very different socio-religious context. I can work on the Sabbath and be a faithful Christian, but if Christ worked on the Sabbath, he was either a wicked blasphemer or he was God. Next, Alex asks why it took Christian society so long to abolish slavery.
Why did it take so long, literally over 1,000 years, for Christian society to abolish slavery?
But this seems confused. During the Middle Ages, slavery wasn't that common in Christendom, and there's some evidence it was de facto abolished at various points. When Christians encountered slavery in the 17th and 18th century in West Africa, it was a whole different beast, and Christians almost immediately began campaigning against it. Considering the obvious economic incentives in having free labor, it's insane that Christians abolished slavery so quickly once they got a real taste of it. But either way, Zuma's point was that Christian society was the first to abolish slavery, and that's not really something that can be disputed.
Okay, to say that I today am against slavery due to exclusively Christian influence is laughable. I know this whole Western ethics are all secretly Christian idea is popular at the moment, but you show me exactly where in your Bible I can find justification for abolishing slavery.
Christian influence doesn't have to be biblical influence. The Bible does say to love your neighbor as yourself, and many Christians interpreted that as precluding slavery. There's also the book of Philemon, which suggests that emancipating your slaves is good. It doesn't matter that there's no explicit condemnation of slavery. What matters is that for actual Christians, even these implicit condemnations were were enough to motivate them to oppose slavery. Far from it being laughable, it seems quite likely that without Christian influence, Alex wouldn't be against slavery.
Yes, Christians today may condemn slavery, but if we turned back the clock, got in a time machine and went and visited Europe in a time before abolition, and we tried to abolish slavery, where is the first place that the locals would turn, and plausibly so, to defend it as an institution?
This is honestly a really bizarre point because firstly he says a time before abolition, but like I already said, slavery was barely even a thing in much of Europe for most of the period before official abolition, so it's hard to imagine how that conversation would even go down. But let's assume he's talking about the 17th and 18th centuries. Well, some people might have, but it's also true that the Bible was the first place people turned to while arguing to abolish it. In fact, when Europe was once a more religious place, chances are the primary place anybody would turn to defend anything is the Bible, so this doesn't prove much. Next, Alex just misunderstands one of Zuma's points.
It's a hell of a response to the problem of natural evil. Why does God allow millions of people to die in earthquakes or tsunamis, or indeed kill them himself on purpose? Because he can.
See, the point that Zuma is making here is that specifically the argument that God directly kills people is a stupid argument because God kills everybody. Why God kills people in general is a separate question, but the point is that as a Christian I believe that God numbers everyone's days, so is responsible for every death. So somebody saying, but God kills loads of people in the flood, so that's bad, is just a nonsense objection. Next, Alex agrees that the whole I just believe in one God less than you thing is a bad argument, with one caveat.
I do find that it's a useful tool for helping people to understand what it's like to not believe in God, but it certainly doesn't function as an actual argument against any God.
This is okay, and I can understand his point, but it's unsurprising that myself and Zuma wouldn't see the utility in this because we're both former atheists, and I can certainly say for my part, I understand what it's like to not believe in God, but I can imagine that those raised from birth to believe in God might struggle to understand it. I don't know if this totally gets around the point that believing in no gods is totally different from believing in a god though. Like, even if you explain to a Christian that they don't believe in Zeus, so in the same sense you don't believe in the God of the Bible, okay, but they might still think, yeah, but I can understand not believing in a specific given God, but I can't understand not believing in any God at all. O'Connor also agrees that if there's a first cause, it doesn't make sense to ask what caused that cause.
If they are successful in establishing a first cause, it wouldn't really make sense to ask what caused that cause. Giving it attributes of traditional theism, however, is of course a separate question.
He's right that giving the first cause the attributes of traditional theism is a different question, although I will say that you get at least as far as something supernatural, since the natural world is causal, and therefore something uncaused would have to be outside the natural world. Alex also agrees that God isn't just an ad hoc explanation for gaps in scientific knowledge. And he also agrees that asking if God can make something he can't lift is a poor argument against God, although he does offer up a paradox that he thinks is better.
There are other better paradoxes. Take this one about omniscience. Does God know all true propositions? Most theists would say yes. But if so, that would mean that whenever he knows a proposition, P, he must also then know the true proposition, God knows that P. But this creates a new true proposition. It's true that God knows that P. But this creates a new true proposition, and so on to infinity.
He actually says that there are potential responses here, but he just thinks it's interesting to think about. My instinct is to think that the infinite nature of God means he's the only being who could encompass within his knowledge an infinite sequence, like God knows all numbers, but maybe I'm missing something. Alex also has an interesting argument to defend the idea that religion is in fact just wishful thinking. He basically says that the negatives of Christianity are compensated for from the perspective of people who have no earthly power.
For a great many people throughout history, who Nietzsche calls the slave class, they've been simply unable to avoid being weak, servile, and submissive. This is just their position in life, and there's no hope of changing it.
Now, I for my part don't really lack earthly power, so this doesn't apply to me, but I did actually already make the point in my original response to Zuma that I think the positives definitely compensate for the negatives in Christianity. My big focus was on the whole eternal bliss thing, which Alex doesn't even mention. But my point was that it isn't wishful thinking in that if you wanted to invent a religion to maximize people's earthly desires, it wouldn't be Christianity. I mean, when I was at university, I had a lot of casual sex. And while I still had a lot of casual sex after I became Christian, I'd have rather followed a religion that didn't make me feel so guilty about it. So if I was wishing for a religion, it wouldn't be Christianity. Next we get some more qualified agreement with Alex saying that he agrees chemicals in the brain explaining why we believe doesn't disprove that there could be a spiritual dimension too, before he adds,
"But if no experience that I've ever had of my wife was caused by something in the natural world, would you think that my wife must be some supernatural entity that my brain is intercepting? Or would you think that maybe she doesn't exist and that my brain has invented her?"
I'm so confused about this point. If no experience of your wife was caused by something in the natural world, then that precludes the possibility that you've invented her, since your imagination is something that exists in the natural world. So if no experience of your wife is caused by something within the natural world, the only other possibility is that it's caused by something outside the natural world, which is to say, supernatural. Next we get an agreement on 3 more arguments I'm not going to even mention. Alex agrees that they're bad arguments for atheism, and even speculates that Zuma was probably just including these arguments as filler towards the end of the video.
I suppose Redeemed Zuma is just throwing out a few of the less tenable arguments at the end,
which I suspect is true. Next, and penultimately, Alex suggests that there is a part of there being so many different denominations that doesn't make much sense.
However, I do wonder why God allows so many honest truth seekers to go wrong, to get the wrong interpretation of his words.
Now, my first response here would be that for the most part, the wrong interpretations are about things that aren't that important. Indeed, these are often things that don't really affect denomination, or don't matter enough that somebody would allow them to affect denomination. A really good example of this is that I call myself a Baptist because I agree with the important parts of Baptist theology, but I actually am at best agnostic on the Baptist beliefs about baptism specifically, namely their belief that baptism must be a believer's baptism performed by immersion. Now, since I'm an ex-atheist, I did have a believer's baptism, but my baptism wasn't by immersion. Instead, at a Presbyterian church, a jug of water was poured on my head. According to Baptist teachings, this is actually an invalid baptism. Baptists would say that since in baptism we are metaphorically buried with Christ, so we can share in his resurrection, we must therefore go into the water, just as when we're buried, we go into the ground. I'd point out that you're just as buried if the earth goes on top of you. However, I don't think this actually matters, and certainly not enough to get rebaptized. I'm a bit more suspicious of sprinkling, which I think can less credibly be likened to a burial, but even still, it's not that important. The good news is that even if we all have invalid baptisms, baptism doesn't save us. What saves us is the like figure unto baptism, which is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So that would be my first point. A lot of defining aspects of denominations are actually not that important, and situations where discussing the issues can actually be quite intellectually stimulating and even fellowship building. But what about the more important stuff? Why would God allow so many honest truth seekers to go wrong? Well, honestly, this is a tough question when it comes to atheists and even people who aren't nominally Christian. But it really isn't if we're talking about denominations of Christianity. Because how can it be that somebody who cares enough to seek out truth and is honest enough to follow truth where it leads and also values the Bible enough to be considered a Christian could end up believing something totally wrong? My answer is that they can't. I don't believe somebody can make a sincere and honest effort to become a truthful and faithful Christian and end up a Catholic. All Catholics either don't care enough about the truth to try to discover it, or they are dishonest and refuse to accept what the Bible teaches. This is something that is backed up by my own empirical evidence. I've spoken to hundreds of Catholics and asked them how do they reconcile their religion with the parts of the Bible that obviously contradict it, and every single time I get a response amounting to them lying about what the text says in order to justify their false beliefs. So there's your answer, Alex. How can God allow honest truth seekers to identify as Christian but then get really important stuff wrong? He doesn't. It's never happened. Finally, Alex contends with Zuma's argument that there's no evidence for Jesus outside the Bible. His first argument is that some people doubt the authenticity of the extra-biblical sources presented.
Josephus certainly removes doubt about the existence of Jesus, but the authenticity of a fair bit of this particular passage is under dispute.
But the point is that there is some evidence of Jesus, even if that evidence isn't completely undisputed. People are going to dispute lots of things from 2,000 years ago. And then Alex makes his final point.
If, however, Josephus did write these words, then they clearly weren't enough even to convince him of Jesus' divinity, since he remained Jewish. And so it probably shouldn't convince us either.
Very similar to the last section, this is Alex operating with atheist presumptions to prove atheism. Once you become Christian, or in my case as part of my journey to becoming Christian, you will realize that there is such a thing as spiritual blindness. Josephus was a Jew, the very same religion as the people who knew Jesus was God when Jesus was alive and still murdered him. The very same Jews who today know Jesus is God and still choose to reject him. It's just a very silly point here from Alex.